The 17th.
So, of course, economic issues around Nigeria is top on the list. And yesterday, the International Monetary Fund, they did release their observations after a visit from their staff, the recommendations and observations. So let's drill in onto that. It was captured in the 2024 4 consultation for 2024, Article 4 consultation for 2024. So we have joining us in the studio, the IMF resident representative for Nigeria, Mr. Christian Ebeke, and he came physically to the studio. Good to have you physically right here. I know normally you would be in our Abuja studio, yes, but I mean, we really appreciate your time coming in here. So, I mean, that article was loaded. I think it covered all the major, and IMF has not hidden the fact that they are impressed with the reforms of the present administration. But I mean, I think the first thing would be, while you are impressed with the reforms, the people are not so impressed because of the impacts that the pinch that they're feeling from the time subsidy was removed and all of that. Do you think there was something that was missed out that should have been added to the reforms, or should have been done before, after the reforms, that would have reduced the hit on the people? Because we've seen palliative efforts, but it doesn't seem to have done much.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. It's a really beautiful studio.
Thank
you very much. I think the question that you just asked summarized very well the strategy of this report, right? So the starting point is that there is a new administration, took over a year ago, and that administration inherited an economy struggling with significant imbalances. Inflation was already accelerating. There was a very limited fiscal space. As you know, Nigeria collects very, very little tax revenue when we look at the ratio in percent of GDP. You had Naira pressures that were really, really intensifying. You had issues around foreign international reserves, the backlog, etc. So this administration inherited a very, very difficult economic situation, and the administration took serious and very, very difficult measures quickly after coming into power. So those reforms that were put in place were important. They were timely. But you also have to recognize that currently there is a lot of pain for Nigerians, right? You rightly said it. Food inflation is 40%. Food insecurity is a serious risk in Nigeria. Recent report show you how many millions of Nigerians face this severe situation. And you also have the issue, as I mentioned, of limited fiscal space. So the ability of the government to really embark into counter-cyclical fiscal policy, ability to really spend on education and health because of the tax to GDP ratio is low. So what we recommended in our report is really, first and foremost, to really address the issue of the cost of living crisis. And that's why you have monetary policy really, really focusing on addressing inflationary pressures, tightening monetary policy, mopping up excess liquidity, fixing the foreign exchange market to make sure that the Naira finds a more stable equilibrium that will also benefit the disinflationary trajectory that we see for the rest of the year. At the same time, on fiscal policy, our message is very, very clear. It's very critical to accelerate the implementation of the direct payment to vulnerable households, the scheme that the government has revamped together with the World Bank. That scheme targets 15 million households. Approximately 65 million Nigerians can benefit from a 3-month support of 25,000 a month. This scheme is very important. The way it was revamped includes digital tools so people can get money through their wallet directly. It also includes a proper identification of the beneficiary through identification number and so on and so forth. So accelerating that scheme, making sure that it becomes a blueprint for something maybe more permanent and bigger and agile down the road is very key. Delivering on social protection in Nigeria has to be one of the key immediate response to the social challenges that we see. And down the road, once this is being delivered and this is working effectively, this direct payment or this social assistance, you now start embarking on phasing out other difficult lines on the budget, for example, on the subsidy, right? We estimate this year that based on exchange rate movements and based on international oil prices, fuel and electricity subsidy together can amount to 3% of GDP. Remember, Nigeria last year collected around 9% of GDP in terms of taxes. So 1/3 of this amount is basically funding this costly subsidy. The issue with subsidy is that it's untargeted, it's not well targeted. Everybody benefits from it, including the rich. So moving away from untargeted assistance towards more targeted support to the population by focusing very much on the most vulnerable seems to us the most sensible recommendation at this juncture. So once again, it's very important, given the challenges of today, to really accelerate and implement the direct payment to vulnerable households, strengthening social protection, to make sure that additional reforms that you're going to do, which will have distributional consequences, you make sure that you can actually create these guardrails, these social guardrails, to make sure that the most vulnerable can benefit from the support from the federal government.
But obviously that's a short term, or do you see that social network platform, do you see it being sustained over a long time?
Very good question. In the report, you will see that we make a lot of effort to focus really on the sequencing and packaging of reforms, right? So there are reforms or measures that need to be put in place today because of the urgency of the situation. But that doesn't mean that you don't have a credible plan, a medium-term plan on all possible policy areas. In terms of monetary policy, we are pleased to see that the central bank is fully embarking into inflation targeting, meaning the focus now is really on addressing inflation, because really one of the causes of Naira pressures is the inflation differential between Nigeria and trading partners. So as inflation continues to be 30% or 40%, this is definitely going to fuel additional pressure on the currency, because the currency is losing value every day due to inflation. So the fact that the central bank is refocusing its objective on inflation is a very, very good policy, and this will take a couple of years to be really finalized. On fiscal policy, as you mentioned, the direct payment to vulnerable households is the most immediate policy priority of the moment on fiscal policy, making sure that we can reach out to those people who can not really thrive when the reforms are being implemented in the short run. But there is also a clear plan that we were pleased to see in the administration, the work of the tax committee, the committee on tax and fiscal policy reforms. That committee has a very comprehensive agenda on how to really raise revenues in Nigeria. And why are we insisting on raising revenues? It's not because we just want to see a better fiscal books or numbers. Is really because once the administration is able to raise more revenues, these provide the needed space to actually reinvest the money into education, into health, into infrastructure, into security. So raising revenues is the most sensible way to make sure that you can still provide to the population while maintaining less risky fiscal trajectory and maintaining debt sustainability. So this is very, very important. The same issue for the fuel subsidy, right? So this should be part of the plan. Right now, subsidies are costly. They take up a big part of the budget. But again, our recommendation is deliver on social protection first. Once this is working and the targeting is done and this system is working well and you can reach out to those who cannot really thrive by themselves, then you start phasing out the fuel and electricity subsidy in a manner that still protect the poorest and in a manner that ensure that the savings that you get from there are used again for what is really going to sustain long-term growth, which is security, education, health, infrastructure.
What do you say to people who feel that it's good that the CBN says it's going to be targeting inflation, but perhaps it's targeting, it's approaching it wrongly, because a lot of Nigeria's inflation seems to be supply push. So, for instance, if you look at food inflation, it's probably being pushed because of the supply, which is affected by insecurity. So if you focus on tightening, you may just be squeezing life out of the real sector, because the real cause of inflation is still left undone.
I think on these important issues and within the policy debate, it is important to remain driven by solid analysis. And in this report, we actually spend some time to try to understand what are the drivers of inflation in Nigeria and what are the drivers of currency movements also in Nigeria. When it comes to inflation, our analysis that you can find in the annex of the report clearly shows that loose financial condition, the persistent monetization of the fiscal deficit, the ways and means, the central bank financing of the fiscal deficit. These factors, the loose financial condition, loose fiscal policy, were actually one of the key drivers of inflationary pressures in Nigeria, right? It's also true that inflation is driven also by structural factors, including climate shocks, including other structural factors you may think of. But in the report, we clearly demonstrated that loose financial condition, deficit monetization were part of the big increase that we saw in prices accumulated over the years. So hence the central bank response, addressing the component of inflationary pressures that are coming from areas where the central bank has a comparative advantage. The central banks can tighten financial conditions, so that will reduce pressures on inflation. The central bank can also, together with fiscal policy, agree on terminating this strategy that was in the system for years, meaning the ways and means and the direct financing of the deficit by the central bank. This created just excessive money supply. So we had excessive naira in the system compared to the dollar that the economy was able to generate. And these imbalances between naira and dollar created this pressure on the exchange rate that ultimately, again, fed into higher inflation. So the bottom line here is the refocus on inflation by the central bank and the tightening of financial condition is the right approach in order to curb inflationary pressure. But still, this job cannot only be done effectively if it's only the central bank that is doing the job, right? So policy coordination with fiscal policy also is very, very important. Imagine a situation where the central bank is tightening fiscal monetary policy, but fiscal policy is very loose. So these two go into opposite direction, and that will not necessarily achieve the intended objective of stabilizing inflation and the naira. So we are pleased to hear that more coordination is being sought by the central bank and the Ministry of Finance. We see that, for example, the announcement that over time, this direct financing of the deficit will no longer be something that we will see, that they agree on terminating the monetization of the deficit. We also see a lot more commitment by the fiscal authorities to really raise more revenue and tighten fiscal policy in a way that is going to expand the space in order to redirect the resources into what is really needed for Nigeria, which is security, which is health, education, infrastructure.
So I'll just do the final question as an opportunity for you to react to some perceptions. I know the IMF has seen this, and a lot of Africans feel that the IMF is not very friendly, to the growth of the economy, because some of the recommendations would be, increase taxes, take away subsidy and all of that. So there's some negative sentiment. I'm sure you're aware of that. What would you say to Nigerians or Africans with this impression about the IMF?
I think, perception is something that you can't really control. Perception is based on people's personal views on things. I think it's very important just to put out there the facts and put out there solid analysis based on robust work that IMF staff do. And the fact that we are an independent institution focusing really on data, focusing on stress testing scenarios, and trying to analyze different ways of approaching questions, and also seeing example of what has been done in other countries with similar characteristics, etc. This is really the bread and butter of what we do every day. We have expertise because we also we have a larger membership, and we see reforms happening in many other countries, and we take lessons, and we also strengthen our policy advice in that regard. In the case of Nigeria, our advice again has to be very simple and very clear. When it comes to the issue of subsidy that you mentioned, our advice is very clear. You start with addressing and scaling up and accelerating a social protection system in Nigeria to reach out to who? The most vulnerable. We are calling for an acceleration of the direct payment to vulnerable households to make sure that those who cannot cope in this difficult and challenging environment get help from the federal government, and also can continue also performing their daily activities. Once you have done this, once you have scaled this up, and once it's up and running, then you start phasing out the costly fuel and electricity subsidies that are taking a big portion of your revenues. And why are you scaling this? Why are you phasing out this subsidy? To generate savings, then you can now reuse again for the majority of the population in terms of education, health, and infrastructure. So to us, this seems very much like a pro-growth and inclusive growth agenda, where the sequencing starts with you protect the most vulnerable, then you generate savings, and you work towards a better reallocation of resources to promote long-term growth. In my view, this is a pro-growth and pro-inclusive agenda that we're pushing in the case of Nigeria, and we are pleased that this is resonating well within the administration.
All right, thank you so much for your time. Christian Beke is the IMF resident representative for Nigeria.
Thank you very much.